Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I'd love to know. Share it in the comments along with how you liked the story. I reply to every single one of you. Now let's step into the mystery. In the icy grip of a Copenhagen blizzard, a glamorous winter party turns deadly when art dealer Victor Lang is found bludgeoned in the snow, his secrets frozen with him. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming English sleuth with a mind sharper than a Viking blade. As guests whisper lies in shadowed villas, blackmail, affairs, and a stolen ancient brooch, she unravels a web of poison, betrayal, and hidden passions. Was it the jealous hostess, the ruthless importer, or a lover's fatal revenge? Join Miss Marple in this chilling Agatha Christie-style thriller, where every footprint in the snow hides a clue, and no one is who they seem. One wrong step, and the killer strikes again. Will you spot the truth before the storm buries it forever? Dive into The Corpse in the Snow of Copenhagen, a mystery that will grip your soul from the first flake. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Invitation. The train from London had been a tiresome affair, with its jolting rhythms and draughty compartments, but Miss Jane Marple had borne it with her customary equanimity. Now, as she descended onto the platform at Copenhagen Central Station, she drew her soft woolen shawl closer about her shoulders, shielding herself from the crisp Danish air. It was mid-December, and the first flakes of snow were already dancing lightly in the lamplight, settling like a delicate veil over the bustling scene. Travellers hurried past with purposeful strides, their breath forming fleeting clouds, while vendors hawked hot chestnuts and newspapers emblazoned with headlines about the city's festive preparations. Miss Marple paused for a moment, adjusting her sensible hat and glancing about with mild curiosity. She was no stranger to travel, though such journeys were rare for her these days. At 70-something, she preferred the quiet rhythms of St. Mary Mead, where one knew one's neighbours and their little secrets. But the letter had arrived unexpectedly, penned in the elegant hand of her old friend, Lady Eleanor Hargrove, née Eleanor Fanshawe, from their youthful days at a finishing school in Switzerland. Eleanor, widowed young, and now remarried to a Danish importer of some means, had extended an invitation to visit her villa in Fredericksburg for the holidays. "Do come, Jane," the letter had urged. "The snow here is quite enchanting, and our little gathering promises to be most diverting. There are people you simply must meet, artists, scholars, and one or two with stories that would curl your hair." Miss Marple had smiled at that, folding the letter away. Stories that would curl one's hair? Eleanor had always been one for drama, even in her girlhood. Yet there was an undercurrent in the words, a faint plea, perhaps, or the shadow of something unspoken. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was much the same the world over. A change of scenery merely altered the backdrop, not the play. She had packed her few necessities, a sturdy umbrella, her knitting, and a volume of Danish folklore, and set off intrigued despite herself. A young man in a smart uniform approached, touching his cap. "Miss Marple, I'm from the Hargrove household. This way, please." He relieved her of her valise and led her through the throng to a waiting motor car, its engine humming softly against the chill. As they pulled away from the station, the city unfolded before her. The grand spires of churches piercing the twilight, the twinkling lights of Tivoli Gardens just coming to life, and the wide canal-lined streets where bicycles gave way to the occasional horse-drawn sleigh. The snow deepened as they ventured westward, turning the world into a pristine canvas, unbroken save for the tire tracks ahead. It reminded Miss Marple of a winter long ago in her village, when a sudden blizzard had trapped the entire parish indoors, leading to revelations that no amount of mulled wine could warm away. She wondered idly what secrets this foreign snow might conceal. The chauffeur, a taciturn fellow named Jöns, offered little conversation beyond pointing out landmarks, but his glance in the rearview mirror held a trace of respect. Perhaps Eleanor had mentioned her guest's reputation for quiet perceptiveness. The villa came into view at last, perched on a gentle rise overlooking a frozen park. A sturdy, gabled structure of pale brick, its windows aglow with welcoming light. Ivy clung to the walls, dusted white, and the drive was lined with evergreens bent under their snowy burdens. Jens brought the car to a halt, and Miss Marple stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel beneath the fresh powder. The front door swung open immediately, revealing Eleanor herself, wrapped in a fur-trimmed coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Jane, my dear, you've arrived safely. Come in, before you freeze solid." Eleanor's embrace was warm and genuine, but as Miss Marple drew back, she noted the faint shadows beneath her friend's eyes, and the way her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Eleanor was still a handsome woman, her silver-streaked hair coiled neatly, but time and circumstance had etched lines of subtle strain around her mouth. "Thank you, Eleanor. It's been too long," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft and measured. "The journey was uneventful, though this snow is far more insistent than our English variety." They entered the hall, where a maid took Miss Marple's outer things, and a fire crackled invitingly in the grate. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, with garlands of holly adorning the banister. Eleanor led her to a cosy sitting room, where tea was already laid out on a low table, porcelain cups steaming gently. "Now sit and tell me everything. How is dear St. Mary Mead? Still the same delightful hotbed of gossip?" Eleanor poured with practised grace, but her hand trembled ever so slightly. Miss Marple accepted the cup, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Much as ever, I'm afraid. Though we've had our share of excitements lately. A missing brooch here, a suspicious accident there. But you, Eleanor, your letter spoke of a gathering. I confess, I'm quite looking forward to it." Eleanor's laugh was a touch too bright. "Oh, yes, tomorrow evening. We've invited a most interesting mix. Victor Lang, the art dealer, you know, the one with those marvellous Scandinavian pieces. Then there's Ingrid Peterson, a young Norwegian heiress with a flair for drama, and Professor Voss, the historian, who's positively obsessed with Viking relics. His wife Clara is, well, a force of nature. And Dr. Thorne, our local physician, who's British like you and rather enigmatic. Lars, my husband, bless him, insists on including them all for business reasons, you see, imports and such." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. "Sounds most cosmopolitan. And your husband? I trust he's well." "Very well, though the winter trade has been trying." Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where the snow swirled more vigorously now, as if the storm were gathering strength. "But enough of that. You're here to relax, Jane. Though I must warn you, with this lot, relaxation might be in short supply." Miss Marple smiled inwardly. Relaxation indeed. There was a puzzle here, tucked away in the folds of Eleanor's words, waiting to be unravelled. As the maid announced dinner, she resolved to observe closely. After all, in her experience, the most unexpected invitations often led to the most surprising conclusions. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The following evening, as the winter sun dipped below the horizon with unseemly haste, the Hargrove villa transformed into a beacon of warmth against the encroaching darkness. Lamps glowed softly in every window, casting golden pools on the snow-covered lawns, while inside the air hummed with the low murmur of voices and the occasional trill of laughter. Miss Jane Marple, having spent a restful afternoon perusing Eleanor's collection of antique books in the library, now made her way downstairs, her steps light and deliberate on the polished oak stairs. She wore a simple black dress, adorned only with a brooch of seed pearls, a relic from her aunt's estate, and carried her knitting bag as faithfully as a soldier his rifle. The drawing-room was a splendid affair, panelled in dark wood that gleamed under the chandelier's crystal facets. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its flames leaping hungrily over logs of birch, filling the space with the comforting scent of smoke and resin. Guests clustered in small groups, cradling glasses of mulled wine spiced with cloves and cinnamon, the steam rising like ethereal whispers. Eleanor, resplendent in a gown of emerald velvet that accentuated her poised elegance, flitted from one cluster to another, ensuring glasses were topped and introductions made. Her husband, Lars Hargrove, stood at the centre like a genial colossus, his broad shoulders straining against a tailored jacket, his voice booming as he gestured animatedly. Miss Marple settled into a high-backed armchair near the fire, partially obscured by a potted fern, from where she could observe without drawing undue attention. Her knitting needles emerged from the bag, clicking in a steady rhythm that blended seamlessly with the room's symphony. She had always found that people revealed more when they believed themselves unobserved, much like the villagers in St. Mary Mead, who gossiped freely at the tea shop, unaware of the sharp ears behind the counter. Her gaze first alighted on Victor Lang, the art dealer Eleanor had mentioned with a mix of admiration and caution. He was a man of middle years, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered of Savile Row tailoring, his dark hair slicked back with just a hint of silver at the temples. Lang moved through the room with the grace of a panther, his smile sharp and predatory, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally white. He was engaged in conversation with Ingrid Peterson, the young Norwegian heiress, whose laughter pealed like silver bells. Ingrid was a vision of Nordic beauty, tall and lithe, with hair the colour of spun gold cascading over her shoulders, and eyes as blue as a fjord under summer skies. Her gown, a daring confection of sapphire silk, clung to her figure, and around her neck hung a necklace of diamonds that caught the firelight and threw it back in dazzling sparks. But Miss Marple noted the way Ingrid's fingers toyed nervously with the gems, and how Lang's hand lingered a fraction too long on her arm as he leaned in to murmur something intimate. A flirtation, perhaps, or something more calculated. It reminded her of young Elsie back home, whose dalliances with the travelling salesman had ended in tears and a hasty wedding. Nearby, Professor Henrik Voss held court with his wife Clara. The professor was a gaunt figure, his face etched with the deep lines of scholarly pursuits, his spectacles perched precariously on a beak-like nose. He specialized in Viking artifacts, Eleanor had explained, and his passion for the subject was evident in the fervent way he waved his brandy glass, sloshing the amber liquid perilously close to the rim. The sagas are not mere tales, he was declaiming to a bemused Lars. They are keys to unlocking the barbaric splendor of our ancestors. Clara Voss, a woman of formidable presence with sharp features and hair pulled into a severe bun, interjected with a tart remark. Henrik, do spare us the lecture. Not everyone shares your obsession with rusty swords and pagan baubles." Her voice carried an edge, honed perhaps by years of academic squabbles, and Miss Marple detected a flicker of resentment in her eyes as she glanced toward Dr. Elias Thorne, who stood apart by the window. Dr. Thorne was an intriguing contrast to the others, a British expatriate physician, his frame lean and wiry, clad in a subdued tweed suit that spoke of understated competence. His hair was prematurely grey, and his eyes, a piercing hazel, held a quiet intensity that suggested depths unexplored. He sipped his wine sparingly, his demeanour reserved, yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of restlessness, as if he were a coiled spring awaiting release. He had exchanged pleasantries with her earlier, inquiring politely about her journey, but his questions had a probing quality, like a doctor assessing symptoms. Thorne's exile to Denmark puzzled her. What had driven a man of his evident intellect from England's shores? She recalled Dr. Haydock in St. Mary Mead, whose calm exterior masked a penchant for intrigue, and wondered if Thorne harboured similar secrets. Lars Hargrove, ever the affable host, clapped Professor Voss on the back with a laugh that echoed off the walls. "Come now, Henrik, your Vikings have nothing on my tales from the East. Why, last shipment from Shanghai included a jade dragon that could fetch a king's ransom." Lars was a robust Dane, his ruddy face framed by a neatly trimmed beard, his eyes twinkling with the merriment of a man who had built his fortune on exotic imports. Yet Miss Marple noticed how his gaze darted occasionally to Victor Lang, a shadow crossing his features before he banished it with another hearty guffaw. Business rivals, perhaps? Or partners in some venture best left unmentioned? As the evening progressed, the snow outside began to fall in earnest, fat flakes whipping against the panes like impatient fingers tapping for entry. The wind howled through the chimneys, adding a dramatic underscore to the conversations within. Eleanor dimmed the lights slightly, encouraging the group to draw closer to the fire, and soon the talk turned to local scandals, as it inevitably did in such gatherings. It was Professor Voss who broached the subject of the recent theft at the National Museum. "You've all heard, I presume. The priceless Viking brooch, gone? Vanished from its case without a trace. A masterpiece of filigree gold, inscribed with runes that could rewrite our understanding of the Norse migrations." His voice rose in indignation, and he thumped his fist on the arm of his chair for emphasis. Ingrid leaned forward, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "How dreadful! Was it very valuable? I mean, beyond the history?" "Valuable?" Voss snorted. "Incalculable, and the security laughable. I warned them months ago about vulnerabilities in the display halls. Mark my words, it's an inside job. Someone with access. Someone who knew the patrols. Thieves among us. Perhaps even in this very city." Clara rolled her eyes. "Henrik, you're being dramatic. It's probably some clever cat burglar, not a conspiracy." Victor Lang chuckled softly, swirling his wine. "Ah, but drama makes life interesting, doesn't it? I've dealt in antiquities long enough to know that every artifact has a story, and often a shadow. Who knows? The brooch might resurface on the black market, fetching a price that would tempt even the most upright soul." Dr. Thorne, who had been staring out at the storm, turned slowly. "Temptation is a subtle poison, Mr. Lang. It creeps in unnoticed until it's too late." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch as she absorbed the exchange. The words hung in the air like smoke, laden with unspoken implications. It put her in mind of the pilfered silver chalice from the church in St. Mary Mead, where the thief had been the verger himself, driven by debts no one suspected. Here, too, motives might lurk beneath the surface: greed, envy, desperation. She glanced at Lars, whose face had paled slightly at the mention of the black market, and at Eleanor, who busied herself refilling glasses with a forced smile. The storm intensified, rattling the windows with gusts that seemed to shake the very foundations of the villa. Thunder rumbled distantly, an unusual accompaniment to the snow, as if nature itself conspired to heighten the tension. Conversations fragmented, voices rising to compete with the wind, when suddenly a piercing scream shattered the night. It came from the garden, raw and terrified, cutting through the howl like a knife. The room froze, glasses clattered to the floor. Lars bolted upright. "What in God's name?" Eleanor clutched her throat. "The greenhouse! Someone's out there!" Without a word, the guests surged toward the French doors, flinging them open to the blizzard's fury. Lanterns were grabbed from the hall, their beams slicing through the swirling white as they plunged into the frozen chaos, hearts pounding with dread at what they might find. Miss Marple, rising more slowly, felt a familiar prick of anticipation. The storm had broken, and with it, the facade of civility. Chapter 3. The Frozen Discovery. The storm's ferocity seemed to mock the fragility of human warmth as the guests of the Hargrove Villa spilled into the snow-choked garden. The wind howled like a banshee, driving icy flakes into their faces, and the lanterns they clutched cast wild, flickering beams that danced across the drifts. Miss Jane Marple, trailing the others with her careful steps, pulled her shawl tighter, her breath catching in the frigid air. The screams still echoed in her mind, sharp and desperate, a sound that reminded her of Mrs. Carter's cry in St. Mary Mead when she'd stumbled upon her husband's betrayal. Though this, she sensed, was no mere domestic squabble. Lars Hargrove led the charge, his burly frame cutting a path through the snow toward the greenhouse, a glass structure barely visible through the blizzard's veil. Eleanor clung to his arm, her face pale as the frost, while Victor Lang's absence was conspicuous. He had been seen slipping out earlier, muttering about needing air. Ingrid Peterson, her sapphire gown now hidden beneath a borrowed coat, stumbled alongside Professor Henrik Voss, whose spectacles fogged with each laboured breath. Clara Voss, her lips set in a grim line, kept pace with Dr. Elias Thorne, who moved with a physician's purposeful calm, his eyes scanning the ground as if already diagnosing the scene. Miss Marple, guided by Jens the chauffeur, who had appeared with a sturdy torch, noted the chaos of footprints already blurring under fresh snow. The greenhouse loomed ahead, its panes frosted over, a faint glow from within suggesting a lantern or heater left burning. As they drew closer, Ingrid gasped, pointing to a dark shape half buried in a snowdrift near the structure's base. "There!" she cried, her voice trembling. "Oh heavens, what is it?" Lars reached the spot first, dropping to his knees with a grunt. He brushed away the snow, revealing the crumpled form of Victor Lang. The art dealer lay face up, his once sleek hair matted with ice, his eyes staring blankly at the storm-tossed sky. A thin rivulet of blood, now frozen into a crimson stain, traced from his temple to his cheek, stark against his pallor. Beside him, partially buried, lay a heavy iron garden trowel, its handle crusted with frost, but its blade ominously clean save for a faint smear of red. Dr. Thorne knelt beside the body, his gloved fingers probing gently at the neck. "No pulse," he announced, his voice steady but grave. "Dead, likely within the hour. Blunt force trauma to the skull, from that trowel I'd wager. But look, his pockets are turned inside out. Robbery, perhaps? Miss Marple, standing just beyond the circle of light, peered closely at the scene. The turned-out pockets were theatrical, almost staged, reminding her of a village play where the props were arranged just so to mislead the audience. She noted a curious detail. A small patch of snow near Lang's right hand was melted, forming a shallow depression as if something warm, a flask, a compress, or something else entirely, had rested there briefly before being removed. Her knitting bag hung heavy at her side, but her mind was already stitching together possibilities. Eleanor stifled a sob, clutching Lars's arm. Who could do this? Victor was difficult, but this? Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of something, guilt, fear, in her friend's eyes before she turned away. Professor Voss, his face ashen behind his spectacles, muttered, "Barbaric, like some Viking blood feud. He was alive not an hour ago, arguing with me about that blasted brooch." His wife, Clara, shot him a sharp look, as if warning him to say no more. Ingrid, trembling visibly, wrapped her coat tighter. I was in the library, alone, reading. I heard nothing until the scream. Who screamed anyway? Her eyes darted nervously, seeking reassurance, but no one answered. The wail of sirens cut through the storm, and soon Inspector Knudsen of the Copenhagen police arrived, his heavy coat dusted with snow, his moustache bristling as he took charge. A stocky man with a no-nonsense air, he barked orders to his men, who cordoned off the area with ropes and lanterns. "No one leaves this house," he declared, his Danish accent clipped but clear. "Mr. Lang was seen quarrelling with several of you tonight. We'll have questions for all." As the police set to work, photographing the scene and wrapping the trowel in evidence cloth, Miss Marple lingered near the greenhouse, her torchlight catching on a glint of metal half buried in the snow. A cigarette butt, its filter crumpled but intact. She recognized the brand from Professor Voss's habit, though he'd claimed to be inside during the critical hour. She tucked the observation away, like a dropped stitch to be picked up later. Inside, the guests were herded back to the drawing room, where the fire now seemed to mock their chilled spirits. Inspector Knudsen began his interrogations, starting with Lars. "You and Lang had words earlier, yes? About a business deal gone sour." Lars shifted uncomfortably, his usual joviality dimmed. "A disagreement, nothing more. Victor tried to undercut me on a shipment of jade. I told him to back off, but it wasn't worth killing over." Eleanor, seated beside him, twisted her hands in her lap. "Victor was provocative. He'd been hinting at some scandal, something to do with Lars's imports. I thought he was just stirring trouble." Miss Marple, ensconced once more in her armchair, listened as the others offered their accounts. Ingrid insisted she'd been alone in the library, nursing a broken heart over a lost love back in Oslo. A story delivered with such theatrical flair that Miss Marple wondered at its truth. Professor Voss admitted to stepping out for a smoke, but swore he'd returned before the scream. Clara contradicted him, saying he'd been gone longer than he claimed, her voice tinged with irritation. Dr. Thorne, calm as ever, mentioned seeing Lang head toward the garden around 9, but had no alibi of his own, claiming he'd been checking his medical bag in the study. As the inspector pressed on, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind turning over the details like a jeweler examining facets. The melted snow nagged at her, a clue too deliberate to be accidental. It reminded her of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a spilled teacup had betrayed a murderer's haste to cover their tracks. Had someone here staged the robbery to obscure a darker motive? Lang's quarrels, his hints of scandal, and that missing Viking brooch from the museum, surely they were threads of the same tapestry. She caught Dr. Thorne's eye across the room, his gaze lingering on her, as if assessing her own quiet scrutiny. There was something about him, a stillness that masked calculation, much like the village chemist who'd once poisoned a rival under the guise of dispensing medicine. And Eleanor's nervousness, Lars's defensiveness, each gesture was a note in a discordant melody. As the police carried Lang's body away, shrouded against the storm, Miss Marple rose, her expression as mild as ever. "A tragedy, indeed," she murmured to Eleanor, who nodded weakly. But inwardly, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity, sharp as a winter's edge. The snow might cover tracks, but it could not hide the truth forever. Not from someone who knew where to look. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Shadows. The Hargrove Villa, once a haven of festive cheer, now seemed to huddle under the weight of suspicion as dawn broke over Copenhagen. The storm had relented, leaving a world of glittering snow that sparkled deceitfully under a pale sun. Inside, the air was thick with unease, the guests moving like chess pieces on a board where the rules were unclear. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with a cup of tea, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her knitting lay idle for once, her fingers steepled thoughtfully as she replayed the night's grim events. The murder of Victor Lang had cast a pall over the gathering, and the questions raised by Inspector Knudsen's brusque interrogations lingered like unwelcome guests. Eleanor, looking drawn and fragile in a high-necked sweater, joined her, offering a wan smile. "Jane, you're a marvel of calm. I confess, I barely slept. Poor Victor, who could have done such a thing?" Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple noted the way her friend's eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. "Murder is always a shock, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, her tone as soothing as a vicar's sermon. "But often the truth lies in what people don't say. Tell me, Eleanor, what was Victor Lang to you? He wasn't just a guest, was he?" Eleanor's cup rattled in its saucer, a betrayal of nerves. After a pause, she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You always see through things, don't you? Victor was trouble. He was blackmailing Lars, you see. Something about forged documents for those artifacts Lars imports. Victor claimed he had proof that could ruin us. Lars paid him off last week, but Victor kept pressing for more." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind alight with connections. Blackmail was a dangerous game, one she'd seen played out in St. Mary Mead, when the grocer's wife had threatened to expose a neighbour's indiscretions, only to find herself outmanoeuvred. "And you, Eleanor, did Victor have anything on you?" she asked, her voice as soft as the snow outside. Eleanor flushed, her fingers twisting a napkin. "Nothing worth killing over," she said quickly, too quickly. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, knowing it often coaxed truths from reluctant tongues, but Eleanor rose abruptly. "I must check on the staff. Excuse me, Jane." Left alone, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts weaving through the tangle of motives. Blackmail suggested secrets, and secrets suggested power. Power someone might kill to protect. She resolved to explore the villa's grounds, where the snow might yet hold clues the police had overlooked. Bundling herself in a borrowed coat, she ventured out, her boots crunching through the fresh drifts. The greenhouse, now cordoned off with police tape, stood like a sentinel in the garden. its glass panes catching the weak sunlight. Miss Marple circled it carefully, her eyes scanning the ground. The cigarette butt she'd noticed last night, Professor Voss's brand, was gone, likely collected by Knudsen's men. But near the base of a yew hedge, she spotted another clue. A single footprint, partially filled with snow, its outline suggesting a woman's shoe smaller than Ingrid's dramatic heels, but too elegant for a servant's practical boots. Clara Voss, perhaps? Or Eleanor herself? Returning indoors, Miss Marple made her way to the library, drawn by its promise of quiet and the chance to overhear unguarded words. The room was a haven of leather-bound tomes and heavy drapes, the air faintly scented with old paper and wax polish. As she approached, she heard low, urgent voices from within. Pausing just outside, she caught Clara Voss's sharp tones. "You fool, Elias! If they find out about us, we're done for. Henrik suspects something, and now with Victor dead—" Dr. Thorne's voice, calm but strained, cut in. "Keep your voice down, Clara. No one knows, and no one will, unless you lose your nerve. Victor's death has nothing to do with us." Miss Marple's lips pursed. An affair, then, hardly surprising, given Clara's barbed exchanges with her husband and Thorne's guarded demeanour. It reminded her of the scandal at the St. Mary Mead Vicarage, where a curate's dalliance had unravelled a web of deceit. But was this affair motive enough for murder, or merely a distraction? She slipped away before they noticed her, returning to the drawing-room, where Inspector Knudsen was overseeing a search. His men had turned up a startling discovery. The missing Viking brooch, its golden filigree unmistakable, nestled in a velvet pouch inside Ingrid Peterson's suitcase. Ingrid, summoned to explain, stood pale and defiant, her eyes flashing with indignation. "I've never seen it before. Someone planted it, I swear. Why would I steal a brooch when my own jewels are worth 10 times that?" Knudsen's moustache twitched sceptically. "Miss Peterson, you were seen speaking with Lang before he died. Witnesses say you argued something about a debt." Ingrid's composure faltered. "Not a debt, a misunderstanding. Victor, he made advances, promised me connections in the art world. I rebuffed him, and he got angry, but I didn't kill him." The inspector, unmoved, ordered her detained pending further investigation. The other guests exchanged uneasy glances, but Miss Marple shook her head slightly. The brooch in Ingrid's luggage was too convenient, like a prop, placed to mislead. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen locket had once been slipped into a maid's apron to divert suspicion from the true thief, a parallel too striking to ignore. As the room emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze falling on a side table where a silver tray held an assortment of glasses from the previous night. One, etched with a delicate pattern, bore a faint residue of red wine, its rim smudged in a way that suggested a hurried wipe. She recalled the melted snow near Lang's body and wondered if a glass, or its contents, might have played a role. Poison, perhaps? The idea nagged at her, for poison was a subtle killer, often chosen by those who wished to avoid confrontation. She approached Lars, who stood brooding by the fireplace, his usual bonhomie replaced by a tense silence. "Mr. Hargrove," she said softly, "you mentioned a disagreement with Mr. Lang over jade. Was there more to it? Something, perhaps, about the museum theft?" Lars's eyes widened, then narrowed. "You're a sharp one, Miss Marple. Victor was meddling in things he shouldn't have, asking questions about my suppliers, hinting he'd go to the authorities. But I'm no murderer." His defensiveness was telling. but Miss Marple merely nodded, her expression as placid as a village pond. She excused herself and climbed the stairs to her room, where she sat by the window, watching the snow settle into stillness. The villa was a microcosm of secrets, each guest a thread in a knot she was beginning to untie. Eleanor's admission of blackmail, Clara's affair, Ingrid's convenient framing, and that curious melted patch in the snow. Each piece fit somewhere, but the pattern was not yet clear. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of certainty. Murder, like gossip, thrived on hidden truths, and she was determined to coax them into the light, just as she had so often done in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. The Alibi Unravels. The Hargrove Villa, though bathed in the pale glow of a winter noon, seemed to shrink under the weight of its own secrets. The snow outside lay undisturbed now, a pristine shroud that mocked the turmoil within. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with a view of the frosted park, pondered the threads of the case as she might a tangled skein of wool. Ingrid Peterson's detention had eased the immediate tension among the guests, but Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, told her the solution was far from settled. The Viking brooch in Ingrid's luggage was a clumsy misdirection, much like the time Mrs. Price's stolen earrings had been found in a maid's drawer, only to mask a deeper deceit. No, the truth lay elsewhere, in the nuances of behaviour, the slip of a tongue, or perhaps the curious patch of melted snow beside Victor Lang's body. She descended to the drawing-room, where Inspector Knudsen was reviewing notes with a young constable, his moustache quivering with impatience. The other guests had dispersed, Lars to his study, Eleanor to the kitchen, and the Voss with Dr. Thorne to their respective corners, nursing private anxieties. Miss Marple approached the inspector, her demeanour as unassuming as a parish spinster collecting for the church fund. "Inspector," she began, her voice soft but firm, "might I have a word? There are 1 or 2 points about last night that puzzle me." Knudsen raised a sceptical eyebrow, but gestured to a chair. "Miss Marple, is it? I've heard you're something of a sleuth in your village. Very well. What's on your mind?" She settled primly, her hands folded in her lap. "The timeline, Inspector. The storm was fiercest at 9 o'clock, yet Dr. Thorne said Mr. Lang's body was still warm at 10 when found. That suggests a narrow window for the crime. And then there's the melted snow near his hand. A small patch, as if something warm had been placed there briefly. A hot compress, perhaps, or a vessel like a teapot. It's curious, don't you think?" Knudsen's eyes narrowed, but he jotted a note. "A teapot? That's a stretch, ma'am. But the timeline, yes, it's tight. We're checking alibis against it. Anything else?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze mild but piercing. "Mr. Lang's watch. It stopped at 8:45 smashed, yet several witnesses claim he was in the drawing-room until 9:30. Either they're mistaken, or someone tampered with the watch to mislead us." The inspector grunted, clearly intrigued despite himself. "You've a sharp eye. We'll look into the watch. Care to join me at the scene? My men are combing the garden again." Miss Marple acquiesced, bundling into her coat and following Knudsen to the greenhouse. The snow had been trampled by police boots, but the spot where Lang's body had lain was marked by a chalk outline, now dusted with fresh flakes. She pointed to the melted patch, now refrozen into a faint indentation. "There, Inspector. It's small, but deliberate. Someone wanted us to notice something, or to overlook it." Knudsen crouched, frowning. "Could be nothing. Snow melts oddly sometimes, but I'll have it photographed." He straightened, calling to a constable to fetch the coroner's report, which had just arrived. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes tracing the greenhouse's frosted panes. Inside, she glimpsed rows of herbs, foxgloves among them, their leaves a subtle menace. Digitalis, she recalled from a case in St. Mary Mead, could stop a heart if misused. Had Lang been poisoned before the fatal blow? Back indoors, Knudsen summoned Professor Henrik Voss for another round of questioning. The historian shuffled in, his spectacles fogged from the cold, his usual bluster subdued. "I've told you everything," he protested. "I stepped out for a smoke around 8:30, returned by 9. Whoa, I saw nothing." Miss Marple, standing quietly by the fireplace, interjected, gently, "Yet your cigarette butt was found near the greenhouse, Professor. And your wife mentioned you were gone longer, closer to 9:15. Might you have seen Mr. Lang outside?" Voss's face reddened. "Clara exaggerates. I did meet Victor briefly, near the hedge. He wanted to discuss a collaboration, something about the museum theft. He thought I had connections to move stolen artifacts. I told him I wouldn't touch such a thing." Clara, who had entered unnoticed, snapped, "You're a fool, Henrik! Always chasing glory, never seeing the cost." Her voice broke, and she turned to Knudsen. "I've been hiding something. Elias, Dr. Thorne, and we've been close, too close. Victor knew, and he was needling me about it last night. But I didn't kill him." Knudsen's moustache twitched with interest. "An affair, eh? And did Lang threaten to expose you?" Clara nodded, tears brimming. "He hinted as much. But Henrik's my husband. I'd never hurt anyone to protect that secret." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind raced. An affair was a motive, but Clara's distress felt genuine, unlike the calculated tears of a St. Mary Mead widow who'd poisoned her lover to silence him. She turned to Dr. Thorne, who had been called in next, his face a mask of composure. "Dr. Thorne," she said, "you examined Mr. Lang's body. Did you notice anything beyond the head wound? His pallor, perhaps? Or a sign of something subtler?" Thorne hesitated, his hazel eyes meeting hers with a flicker of recognition. "You're perceptive, Miss Marple. Yes, I noticed symptoms. Dilated pupils, slight cyanosis around the lips. Signs of poisoning, possibly digitalis, administered earlier in the evening. The blow to the head was the finisher, but he was already dying." A murmur rippled through the room. Knudsen leaned forward. "Poison? Why didn't you say so last night?" Thorne's jaw tightened. "I wasn't certain until the coroner's report. Besides, I didn't want to cause panic without evidence." Miss Marple's thoughts whirled. Poison suggested premeditation, the blow opportunism, a combination that pointed to multiple actors or a single cunning mind. She recalled a case in her village where a poison tonic had been paired with a staged accident to deflect suspicion. Here, the melted snow and tampered watch hinted at similar misdirection. As Knudsen pressed Thorne for details, Miss Marple slipped away to the dining room, where the previous night's wine glasses still sat on a tray, awaiting the servant's attention. She examined the etched glass she'd noticed earlier, its rim smudged and its contents faintly cloudy. Digitalis could be masked in wine, she knew, its bitter taste lost in the spices of mulled claret. Had someone laced Lang's drink, knowing he'd wander outside to meet his fate? Returning to her room, she sat by the window. Her knitting resumed as a cover for her racing thoughts. The poison, the brooch, the blackmail. Each was a piece of a mosaic, but the central figure remained elusive. Eleanor's nervous glances, Lars's evasive answers. And now Thorne's omission about the poison suggested layers of deceit. It was like the time the St. Mary Mead baker had been blackmailed over a forged recipe, only to reveal a deeper crime of sabotage. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle nearing its resolution. The villa's secrets were like snowflakes, beautiful, fleeting, but destined to melt under scrutiny. She would watch, listen, and wait, for the truth, like a village scandal, could not stay buried long. Chapter 6. The Hidden Motive. The Hargrove villa, though warmed by crackling fires, seemed to pulse with a chill that no hearth could banish. As evening draped its shadows over Copenhagen, the snow outside settled into a quiet, glistening blanket, but within, the atmosphere crackled with unspoken accusations. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, her knitting needles idle for once, as she pieced together the fragments of Victor Lang's murder. The poisoned wine, the staged robbery, the tampered watch, and that curious patch of melted snow. They were like the scattered clues of a St. Mary Mead mystery, where a stolen hymn book had once led to a revelation of embezzlement. Here the stakes were higher, the motives darker, and the truth tantalizingly close. She rose, her movements deliberate, and made her way to the study, where Lars Hargrove kept his business papers. Inspector Knudson's men had searched the villa, but Miss Marple suspected they'd overlooked the subtler traces of human folly. The study was a masculine domain of leather armchairs and polished mahogany, its walls lined with maps of trade routes and shelves of ledgers. A faint scent of cigar smoke lingered, mingling with the wax polish of the desk. She glanced at the door, ensuring she was alone, then began a careful examination of the papers strewn across the blotter. Among invoices for jade and silks, she found a letter, its edges crumpled as if handled in haste. It was addressed to Lars, penned in Victor Lang's sharp, angular script. "Hargrove," it read, "your little scheme with the museum won't stay buried. The brooch is only the start. Pay me double, or the authorities will know your role." The ink smudged oddly at the bottom, as if Lang had hesitated before signing. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Forgery, perhaps? Or a threat meant to provoke? It reminded her of a blackmail note found in the St. Mary Mead postmistress's drawer, which had unravelled a web of village deceit. She tucked the letter back, her mind turning to Eleanor's confession of blackmail and Clara's affair with Dr. Thorne. Each guest was a knot in the tapestry, but the central thread eluded her. The melted snow nagged at her thoughts. A teapot she'd suggested to Knudsen, but why? To plant evidence or obscure it? She recalled the missing teapot from the drawing room, noted during her morning tea with Eleanor. Its absence was no coincidence. Seeking her friend, Miss Marple found Eleanor in the conservatory, tending to a wilting orchid with a distracted air. The glass walls framed a view of the snow-laden garden, where the greenhouse stood as a silent witness to the crime. "Eleanor," Miss Marple said softly, settling beside her, "you've been protecting someone, haven't you? That teapot from the drawing-room, it's gone. Used perhaps to melt the snow near Mr. Lang's body, to plant the brooch, or confuse the timeline." Eleanor's hands froze, the pruning shears trembling. "Jane, how do you—" She stopped, her eyes brimming with tears. "It was an accident, I swear. Lars and Victor argued in the garden over that wretched brooch and the blackmail. Victor fell, hit his head on the trowel. I found them, and I panicked. I took the teapot, poured hot water to melt the snow, and hid the brooch in Ingrid's room to point suspicion elsewhere. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but unyielding. An accident, you say? But the poison, Eleanor? Digitalis in his wine, from the foxgloves here in the conservatory. That was no accident. Victor wasn't just blackmailing Lars, was he? He knew something about you, something personal from years ago. Eleanor's face crumpled, her voice barely a whisper. How did you know? Victor and I, we were lovers long before Lars. In London, after my first husband died. Victor kept letters, foolish, passionate things I wrote. He threatened to show them to Lars, to ruin my marriage, my standing here. I couldn't bear it. So you poisoned his wine, Miss Marple said, not accusingly, but with the quiet certainty of one who'd seen such motives before. You knew he'd die slowly, giving you time to stage the scene. Eleanor nodded, tears spilling. I didn't mean for him to suffer. I just wanted him gone. But Lars, he didn't know about the poison. He thought the blow killed him. Miss Marple sighed, her thoughts drifting to a St. Mary Mead widow who'd laced her husband's tea to escape his cruelty, only to be undone by a misplaced bottle. Human nature, my dear, she said. It's the same in Copenhagen as in my village. Passion and fear, they drive us to desperate acts. She excused herself, leaving Eleanor to her grief, and sought out Inspector Knudsen in the drawing room. The other guests were there, their faces taut with anticipation as Knudsen reviewed the coroner's report, which confirmed digitalis poisoning alongside the head wound. Miss Marple whispered her findings to him, urging a search for the teapot and a closer look at the wine glasses. Knudsen, though initially sceptical, dispatched a constable to the kitchen, where fragments of a shattered teapot were found in a bin, its spout stained with traces of snowmelt. The inspector called, the guests together, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "We've new evidence," he announced, holding up a bagged shard of porcelain. "A teapot used to tamper with the crime scene, and poison, digitalis, in Mr. Lang's system. Someone here planned his death with care." Ingrid, released from custody but still shaken, gasped, "But the brooch! I was framed!" Clara clutched her husband's arm, while Professor Voss muttered about Viking curses. Dr. Thorne's eyes narrowed, his composure unshaken, but Miss Marple caught the slight clench of his jaw. She spoke up, her voice clear and frail, disarming in its simplicity. "Inspector, may I? The poison was administered in the wine, likely during the party. The brooch was planted to mislead, but the real clue is the timeline. Mr. Lang was poisoned first, then struck. 2 acts, perhaps 2 culprits, though I suspect one mind orchestrated it all." Knudsen frowned but nodded. "Go on, Miss Marple." She turned to Eleanor, who stood rigid by Lars. "Mrs. Hargrove, you knew of Victor's blackmail, but also his past with you. The letters he held, were they worth killing for?" Eleanor's knees buckled, and Lars caught her, his face darkening. "What's this, Eleanor? Letters?" Before she could answer, Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "The teapot was used to melt snow, planting the brooch to frame Miss Peterson. But the poison, carefully dosed, points to someone with access to the conservatory and knowledge of its plants. Someone who acted not just from fear, but from a deeper wound." The room held its breath. Knudsen stepped forward, his eyes on Eleanor. "Mrs. Hargrove will need to speak with you, and Mr. Hargrove, your altercation with Lang is documented." As the police led Eleanor aside, Miss Marple retreated to her armchair, her heart heavy. The truth was emerging, but not without cost. It was like the St. Mary Mead grocer's scandal, where love and betrayal had intertwined to deadly effect. She watched the snow fall outside, a silent witness to the unravelling of human frailties, and knew the final act was near. Chapter 7. The Final Revelation. The Hargrove Villa, though grand in its snow-draped elegance, seemed to sag under the weight of its own revelations as the evening of the third day descended. The storm had long passed, leaving Copenhagen's streets hushed and glistening under a crescent moon, but within the villa the air was taut with the promise of resolution. Miss Jane Marple, her grey eyes sharp behind their mild facade, sat in the drawing-room, her knitting bag at her side like a faithful companion. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the assembled guests, each one a study in unease. Inspector Knudsen, his moustache bristling with purpose, stood by the mantel, his notebook open, ready to close the net around Victor Lang's killer. Miss Marple had requested this gathering, her soft voice carrying an authority that belied her frail appearance. She had spent the day turning over the case's intricacies, much as she might unravel a knotted thread in her village of St. Mary Mead. The poisoned wine, the staged robbery, the shattered teapot, and Eleanor's tearful confession. They were pieces of a puzzle that now formed a clear, if tragic, picture. Yet one question lingered. Had Eleanor acted alone, or was there a deeper complicity? The answer, she knew, lay in the subtle cues of human nature. As predictable here in Copenhagen as in her quiet English hamlet. "Inspector," she began, her tone as gentle as a parish tea invitation, "might I address the room? I believe I can clarify the events surrounding Mr. Lang's death." Knudsen nodded, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Go ahead, Miss Marple. You've been right about too much for me to doubt you now." The guests, Lars Hargrove, Ingrid Peterson, Professor Henrik Voss, Clara Voss, and Dr. Elias Thorne, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Eleanor stood apart, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly as if bracing for judgment. Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding attention through sheer presence, and began. "Victor Lang's death was no simple crime," she said, her voice clear and measured. "It was a tapestry woven from greed, fear, and betrayal, threads I've seen before in my village, where human passions run as deep as in any city. Let us start with the poison. Digitalis, derived from the foxgloves in the conservatory, slipped into Mr. Lang's wine during the party. This was a deliberate act, planned by someone with knowledge of the plant and access to the glasses." She turned to Eleanor, her gaze soft but unflinching. "Mrs. Hargrove, you admitted to poisoning Mr. Lang, driven by his blackmail over letters from your past affair. You feared he would expose you, destroying your marriage and social standing. The wine glass with the cloudy residue found on the tray bears traces of digitalis, confirming your hand in it." Eleanor's shoulders sagged, but she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't let him ruin us. I thought a small dose, just enough to quiet him." Lars's face darkened, his fists clenching. "Eleanor, you never told me. Letters? An affair?" His voice cracked with betrayal, but Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him. "There is more," she continued. "The poison was slow, meant to weaken Mr. Lang over hours. But his death came sooner, from a blow to the head with a garden trowel. This was no accident, as you claimed, Mr. Hargrove. You met Mr. Lang in the garden, arguing over his blackmail and his role in the museum theft. You admitted to a struggle, but the force of the blow suggests intent. His pockets were turned out to mimic robbery, a clumsy touch, like something from a penny dreadful." Lars's eyes widened, his ruddy face paling. "I didn't mean to kill him. He lunged at me, raving about the brooch and my business. I pushed him, and he fell, hit his head. I panicked, tried to make it look like theft. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. Panic, perhaps, but the timeline tells a different story. Mr. Lang's watch, stopped at 8:45, was smashed deliberately to mislead us, yet witnesses saw him alive until 9:30. And then there's the melted snow near his body, a small patch created by hot water from the missing teapot, which Mrs. Hargrove used to plant the Viking brooch, framing Miss Peterson. Ingrid gasped, her hand flying to her chest. I knew it. Someone wanted me blamed. Indeed, Miss Marple said, turning to Eleanor. You found Mr. Lang after the struggle, already dying from the poison. You saw an opportunity to divert suspicion, using the teapot to melt snow and place the brooch, knowing it would point to Miss Peterson, whom you viewed as a rival for attention. But the poison was your doing, Eleanor, and the blow was Mr. Hargrove's, a tragic convergence of separate acts. Professor Voss, his spectacles glinting, interjected. But what of my cigarette butt? You thought I was involved. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A distraction, Professor. You were near the greenhouse, discussing the theft with Mr. Lang, but your role was peripheral. As for Mrs. Voss and Dr. Thorne, she glanced at Clara and Thorne, who stiffened. Your affair was another thread, one Mr. Lang used to taunt you. But it was not your hand that struck or poisoned him. Clara exhaled, gripping her husband's arm, while Thorne's face remained impassive, though his eyes betrayed relief. Knudsen stepped forward, holding up the coroner's report and the teapot fragments. We've confirmed the digitalis in the wineglass and found water residue on the trowel, matching the teapot's glaze. Mrs. Hargrove, Mr. Hargrove, you'll come with us. Eleanor broke into sobs, clinging to Lars, who stood rigid, his gaze fixed on the floor. As the police led them away, the room fell silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Ingrid's shoulders relaxed, and she murmured thanks to Miss Marple, who merely inclined her head. The Vossae exchanged a glance, their own tensions unresolved, but no longer central. Dr. Thorne excused himself, citing a need for air, his calm facade barely masking his unease. Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her knitting resumed as if nothing had occurred. Such a pity, she said to no one in particular. Greed and passion, they twist the heart, whether in a Danish villa or a village cottage. As the guests dispersed, she gazed out at the moonlit snow, its purity a stark contrast to the human frailties it had concealed. The case was closed, but its echoes lingered, much like the scandals of St. Mary Mead, where truth, once uncovered, left both clarity and sorrow in its wake. She thought of Eleanor, driven by fear, and Lars, undone by a moment's rage. Their motives were as old as time, their actions as predictable as the seasons. Days later, as she boarded the train back to England, Miss Marple reflected on Copenhagen's snow, a veil for dark deeds, much like the polite facades of her village. She tucked her knitting into her bag, her mind already turning to the next puzzle. For human nature, she knew, would always provide one.